Christine, so stoked to have you on the Mark Divine Show. How are you
Thank you
today?
so much for inviting me. I'm doing well. How are you?
Awesome. No, I'm doing great. I'm sunny and warm out here in California.
Yeah,
What's
it's
it like?
it's hot and humid here in New York
Hot.
City.
Yeah, I remember Brooklyn. I have a place in Park Slope, and that was back in 1983 to 85, I think, something like that. But just changed a lot since then, I bet.
Yeah, no, it definitely has. It's pretty incredible. I've been living in Brooklyn for about 20 years and it's wild how much it's changed.
Yeah, I'd love to get back there and see that because I was actually talking to another guest who lived in New York City the other day, just how much has changed since I was there in the 80s and just radically safer. And I don't know about the last 2 years. I know that there's been some
A little
challenge,
different. Yeah.
right, since COVID, right? But the city's much safer. And then they closed off a lot of streets for, kind of like that street
Yeah.
pedestrian living. And they have a lot of little pop up type restaurant, scenarios going on. It's just really cool what they've done there.
Yeah, no, it definitely is really nice. Like there's at least, and definitely in Brooklyn, there's such a like neighborhood and community feel.
Is that right?
I couldn't have imagined wanting to raise a family here, but it's been amazing and fantastic for my kids.
That's good to hear. But you're originally from California, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah,
Your
I
family?
well, I kind of grew up in Connecticut. My family's all out in
Okay,
California
I
now,
see.
so trying to make my way back.
Yeah, you'll get there eventually. Well, hopefully California can hold it together,
Well,
and turn
that's a
itself around.
whole other story.
That's a different story, right? So you are passionate about just examining the sport of the female side of sports, right? Um, Exercise physiology and just training and all that. But tell us a little bit about before we get into that and your book and all that entails. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what got you, your athleticism, your trials and tribulations that led you down this path.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I just mentioned, I grew up in Connecticut. My dad was a neurosurgeon, so kind of medicine and health related things were always in my life. And
Hmm.
I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be just like him when I grew up, and that's what I thought I was going to do. So I had studied, was pre med in college, had all these plans to go to medical school, but ended up taking some time off and really realizing that while I was interested in health, I it wasn't necessarily the clinical side of things. What I was
Hmm.
really interested in was understanding the underlying infrastructure and systems that supported healthcare in these communities and how we help people be healthy, right? So
Hmm.
that's kind of one side of it and has always been there. Um, Sometimes I feel a little bit like an imposter having written this book. I'm like, I've played sports all my life, since I
Hmm.
was young. I'm not great, right? Like I'm not a
Hmm.
great athlete, but I love moving my body. I love kind of, trying to perform better.
Yeah.
Have loved, like I said, playing sports and, having that camaraderie with my teammates and my friends. So that's always also been like a big part of my life and my identity. I think just in the sense of moving my body and being physically
Hmm.
active has been really important to me and my identity in terms of
Hmm.
feeling grounded, right? Like
Yeah.
feeling like myself. And so as I kind of
What sports did you play, by the way? Sorry.
I feel like
I
I've
like to
played
put a
played
pin occasionally and
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
like dig deeper.
I feel like I've played everything under the sun. I've played field hockey and lacrosse. I swam. I played a little volleyball, a little bit of water polo.
Mm.
Played some soccer. Like when we moved out to California and they didn't have field hockey and
Hmm.
lacrosse, I had to switch to soccer. And then, kind of as an adult, um, have focused more on running, yoga, and
Hmm.
I've kind of skied all my life as well.
Oh yeah. So I've those last three are definitely a big part of my life. Running, I was a runner for years. I don't do it much anymore. In fact, CrossFit kind of
Yeah.
burned that out of me because we'd stop doing long runs and just doing all the sprints, and I actually felt better.
Yeah.
I felt my hips were better and everything. But I've been skiing since I was 4 years old, and I love to get out there on the slopes. And that is a really cool kind of functional, all around athletic type endeavor. And you're out in the beautiful wilderness. Just love that.
Yeah. It's
And yoga,
probably
yoga is just pure daily maintenance. Everyone should be
absolutely.
doing yoga.
Yeah, no, skiing is probably one of my favorite things for that reason, right? It's being out on the mountain. There's nothing quite like it.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I've also skied since I was probably 5 or something like that. So
Hmm. Did you ever try snowboarding? Did you ever get into that at all?
I did. I remember trying it once or twice, hated it.
Mhm.
I think I must have been in college or just after college. But I didn't like having both of my feet stuck on one
Yeah,
board. It
yeah,
made me
me
feel
either.
really claustrophobic. Um, so I've
I
stuck.
totally get that. Yeah, I've felt the same way. When you grow up on skis, snowboarding is very hard to transition to. If you grow up surfing or skateboarding, then snowboarding is easy to transition to. I think it has more in common to those sports. It's a very
Absolutely.
different thing. I tried it about 5 times, and every time I tried it, I nearly killed myself because I kept
Yes,
wanting to point the the snowboard straight downhill and just treat it like a set of skis, and it doesn't work.
absolutely. Yeah. My knees and my butt were like so like bruised and like sore
Hilarious.
afterwards.
So how did you start getting interested in just the women's side of athletics and looking at the nuances around the
Yeah.
differences in male and female training?
Well, when I started in journalism, I knew that I wanted to write about women's specific issues, right? Like at first, it was primarily around healthcare. Again, just trying to understand things that were unique to women.
Mhm,
And it had often felt like, right, those were kind of topics that weren't always given a lot of, page space, if you will.
mhm,
And then as I realized, I was like, oh, wait, I can also write about sports too. Again, I really wanted to understand this, idea of performance and how we improve and how our bodies like adapt to training. But again, through this lens of women, and if there was anything specific and unique with two women, right, and
mhm,
how we approach these things. And just realizing that a it was in part driven by my own personal interest, right? It's like maybe if I write about this and I study this and I talk to all the experts, maybe I'll learn something from this to
mhm,
keep
mhm,
myself like injury free. But then also realizing again that these topics weren't always discussed, right? Like we kind
mhm,
of have very general like health, fitness, injury prevention types of articles out there, but none of them talk specifically about women's physiology or female physiology. And as I
right.
talked more to athletes and talked more to experts, really realizing, oh, wait, it's probably because we don't actually have a lot of research on this. We actually don't know a lot about this area.
Right. It's interesting. I didn't even think about it until I um, saw that we were having this conversation because you're right. Like we don't talk about male performance or female performance. We talk about human performance,
Yeah.
right? And when it comes to athletic training, it's just about looking at the human body as if all bodies were the same, and they're not. So it's fascinating. Now I'm really curious to hear what's different, and some of the things that you've kind of unearthed by looking more closely at the differences instead of this
Yeah.
similarities.
I mean, I think that, what you said, right, in terms of looking at this from a human, like as human performance, I think, actually, for the most part, that does hold true,
Hmm.
right? Like we are we're all humans, like
Hmm.
whether you're in a male body, whether you're in a female body, we are all humans, and there's a lot that does overlap and there's a lot that is in common.
Hmm.
But and I kind of describe it as almost like a Venn diagram, right? Like
Hmm.
where you have like the circle of men here and the circle of
Hmm.
women
Hmm.
here, and there is that overlap, but we just don't know the nature of that overlap, right? Like
Right.
how much it overlaps, as well as like what that section is, right, on the
Hmm.
side that
Hmm.
doesn't overlap, that, relates to women. And that's because we haven't really studied it. And if we think about it, a lot of these sports science studies, in fact, do look at a very narrow population, right? They're in large part these young college age men, right? And that in the grand scheme of things, that is a very narrow sliver of the human population. But yet
Hmm.
we often take the findings from those studies and then apply them broadly across
Hmm.
all populations, right?
Hmm.
So part of it, I guess part of what I'm hoping with this book is really realizing, well, actually we need we need more research in general, right? Like
Hmm.
across a more diverse population. Yes, women, but also from folks from non-westernized countries and,
Hmm.
and from other racial and ethnic backgrounds,
Hmm.
because humans are so wonderfully diverse, and so we need that additional research to really understand and flesh that out a little bit more.
Right.
And I think the other piece of it is really recognizing, for women specifically, is there are physiological things, physiological, anatomical, biological things that do make our bodies different from men, right?
Hmm.
So, one thing in particular that has been getting a lot of airtime is the menstrual cycle, right?
Hmm.
So, this fluctuating cycle of hormones that, go up and down kind of through the course of the month. And so we often only think about that in terms of reproduction and fertility, thinking about when, women might get pregnant. But those hormones actually play a really important and significant role in the body in multiple different systems. So,
Hmm.
as it pertains to bone health, as it pertains to muscle mass and, muscle quality, cardiovascular health, like pretty much everything. But
Hmm.
we only think of it in a very narrow sense, right?
Hmm.
So it's in part just recognizing, yeah, there are these physiological differences, and we just need to kind of understand what's going on and how that may or may not, right, like affect athletic performance and training adaptation.
Hmm. Wow, there's so many directions we can go here. You mentioned, the lunar cycle and the menstrual cycle as being kind of like one area, but
Yeah.
does that, like, can you use that difference and then look at it like almost longitudinally across a different number of domains, right? So it's going to affect recovery, it's going to
Yeah.
affect the nutrition, nutritional needs, it's going to it's going to affect sleep, right? It's going to affect maybe even things like flexibility and mobility. I'm
Yeah.
guessing.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
let's
Because,
talk about like
yeah.
some of the obviously we have these core differences, that being one big one, right? The
Hmm.
reproductive engine, so to speak. And so what does it do? How does it impact
Sure.
an athlete? And then what do we do to optimize our training and recovery and those things that make us long stay in it for the long haul?
Sure. So, one area, like I mentioned, is bone health, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
estrogen is really important in women to help lay down bone and to build
Hmm.
bone mass. And so, this is really critical, especially during like the adolescent and young adult years, because that's really when you're putting down like 80, 90% of your adult bone mass. And so, that's why, we talk about things like the menstrual cycle is really important and why we want, young girls and women to have a regular cycle because you need that monthly surge of hormone to
Hmm.
help maintain, right? Maintain your bone mass. Because if
Hmm.
you don't put down all that bone, if you're not having that regular surge of hormones, then your bone mass decreases and it puts you at risk for early onset osteoporosis, which is
Hmm.
something that we think about, right? As only something that like,
Old
older
people.
people have to
Yeah.
worry about, but it really is a concern for this younger population too. So, it is making sure that, you have a regular cycle, that, it's not irregular, it doesn't go missing. And
And
that's
what
one piece of it.
is it, overtraining that leads to the cycle going
Yeah,
missing or
so
slowing down or stopping or
so
whatever happens?
they researchers have isolated that it's the underlying mechanism really relates to what they call energy availability. And
Hmm.
that's essentially I equate to, the gas in your gas tank in your
Right.
car, right? So you need enough gas in your body to not only support the activities of daily living, but also to support your training and
Hmm.
recovery. So when you
Hmm.
don't have enough energy and you kind of dip below, right, that empty mark, you're sending signals to your body that it's starving and it starts to freak out and it starts to create all these changes to like conserve itself, right? And so one of
Hmm.
those changes is that it starts to down regulate the reproductive system. And so
Hmm.
that's why you start to see this menstrual irregularity. And so that's why a lot of, researchers and scientists, and I think more coaches are getting on board too, or at least understanding the importance of fueling your body really well because it does have all of these other downstream repercussions.
Hmm. I imagine that also applies to sleep because sleep and
Yeah,
fueling are so closely related.
absolutely.
So, if you were designing let's say you were coaching a hybrid athlete sport. Let's say men and women were on a soccer team, and you wouldn't have you would have a different training regimen. Would it be entirely different, or would it be just for a certain period of the month that would be different for women, or how
No,
would it look?
yeah. I mean, that's a great
Do
question
that.
because I think that that's something that a lot of people are starting to wonder, right? So, if these hormones and if the menstrual cycle does potentially impact exercise and training and performance, should we be tailoring our training around the cycle, right? To whether
Right.
it's to harness, these
Hmm.
upswings of hormones, or account for any downswings in hormones. I think at this point, the research is very, it's not conclusive, but I think that it's not necessarily that you have, this is your training program for men and this is your training program
Hmm.
for women. I think it's in part acknowledging the fact that, you know, women do experience sport and physical activity differently. So, what I
Hmm.
mean by that is that the vast majority of women will experience some sort of symptoms related to their menstrual cycle. So, this is like a pretty, simple like piece of this, right? So they will experience symptoms, whether it's cramps, fatigue, muscle soreness, delayed recovery. All of that can potentially impact, right, their motivation to train, their performance on any given training day or
Hmm.
during a game, right?
Hmm. Right.
So I think it's paying attention to those signals and then potentially seeing if there are things you can do to help mitigate that. So, right,
Right.
like if your recovery is delayed or seems to not be going as well, yeah, then it is paying attention to sleep, right? It is paying
Hmm.
attention to nutrition, maybe eating some more anti inflammatory foods to
Hmm.
kind of offset those swings of symptoms so that they don't affect you as much, right? And then noticing if there are times when you do have, more energy,
Hmm.
and trying to, yeah, maybe capitalizing on that. But I don't think it's that it's saying like, oh, you're in, X phase of your cycle, you
Hmm.
can't do this or you shouldn't do this, because we never want to say that to someone. And it's nearly then impossible. Say if you are on a soccer team, right? Like it's impossible to coordinate that across a team.
Yeah.
But I think at this point, it's really for the coaches and the athletic staff to be, one, more mindful of these, the experience that these women might be having in sport, and
Hmm.
not making them feel shamed or feel badly, right, if they are
Hmm.
having cramps or something, anything like that. But figuring out ways to support them through that, right?
Right. Right.
And I think, as we go on, we might find out more information in terms of, well, yeah, maybe women should strength train this way versus men.
Hmm.
But right now, like I said, I feel like as humans, there are some principles that are going to be consistent across men and
Hmm.
women's,
Yeah.
right? Like, so like thinking about periodization of training,
Hmm.
I feel like that's pretty much,
Yeah.
going to be something that will apply regardless of sex or gender.
Yeah, I agree. It's similar. What's going through my mind right now, the emerging conversations in nutrition and medicine about personalization, right?
Yeah.
So there's some things that are generalizable across the population, but then there's other things that are best personalized. So
Yeah.
I think it's the same with training, right? There, athletic skills development, for instance, as a team, you need to do that all together, right?
Yep.
Who's in this position and forward, back, and how's the ball moving, and how you guys working together as a team. That's something that isn't personalized. That's generalized across all the players. Maybe it's personalized for your position or role, but then when it comes to athletic development, that is dependent and personal, right? Based upon your body type, your age, your gender, whether you
Yeah.
have an injury or non-injury or predisposition or non-predisposition, something like that. And so the best coaches are doing this hybrid training plan where they have this generalized plan and then a very specific personalized plan. Is that what
Yeah, I
you're
mean,
seeing?
yeah, that's what I was gonna say, is that like that's hopefully what good coaches are doing, right?
Yeah.
Is that they are in tune with their athletes. They are individualizing it, right? That
Hmm.
there are these general principles, but they're not going to work for anyone or
Hmm.
everyone, right?
Right.
Depending on your specific situation and circumstance. Some people might, for running, right? Some people
Hmm.
might respond better to high mileage training
Hmm.
versus someone might respond better to low mileage training, but you're not going to know that until you kind of experiment a little bit. But then B, that's your job as the coach too, right? To pay
Hmm.
attention to these things and to figure out what's going to work best for your athlete. So I
Right.
think with this more focus on women specific issues, it is another piece of the puzzle that coaches just need to be aware of and potentially pay attention to.
Right. So is your book up to speed, written for the athlete or for the coach or for both?
I think for both, for both.
Mhm.
I think, for the athletes, part of what I hope is that they recognize some of their experiences, right? Because I feel like a lot of active women and women athletes have often had to kind of put part of themselves aside, right,
Hmm.
as they enter into the athletic arena. Like, you don't talk about your cycle, you don't talk about like your boobs hurting or like,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know, incontinence or any of these other issues, right?
Hmm.
You have to almost suck it up in a way. And I know
Yeah.
when I was growing up too, it was very much like this attitude of you can do anything that the boys do, like don't draw attention
Yeah. Right.
to like being a girl or, or
Yeah.
whatever it was.
Equal
um
doesn't mean same.
yeah.
Equal
So
opportunity is not this. Doesn't mean we're all exactly the same. People
exactly.
get that wrong. I get.
So I think like part of it is so that these women can see their experience and realize that they weren't just it wasn't just them, right? They weren't just an exception to the rule.
Hmm.
And then for coaches, I do hope that it does kind of shine some light on some issues that they might not have been aware of before,
Hmm.
right? And I try to write in such a way that combines both like anecdotes from athletes with the science. So it
Hmm.
doesn't read like just a physiology textbook and is a little bit more interesting like than that, but it helps ground some of the science into a real world context.
Right. If if I were listening to this and I'm a female athlete who doesn't have the benefit of a coach, which is a lot of people,
Yeah.
but I love running or I love yoga and I love skiing or whatever. What are some of the most important things that I should be aware of? Let's say do's and don'ts.
Yeah.
Is it, and maybe it's sport specific, but let's go general and then maybe into a specific sports.
Sure. I think that the number one thing that I would say is eat enough. I feel like
Hmm.
for a large number of folks that we just don't eat enough. And I think that's in part, right, because of just the culture that we live in and, all these expectations that are placed on women and like how their bodies are supposed to look that we end up almost doing ourselves a disservice, right? Because we
Right.
aren't eating enough. We're not actually
Interesting.
supporting our bodies to do what we actually want
And
it to
how do
do.
we know what's enough? Right.
That's a
Especially
great,
again,
that's a
I
great
know it's
question.
sports. It's different, for how much metabolic output you have. Like if you're going to be a long distance runner, it's going to be different than if you're just a short
Yeah.
sprint
I
athlete.
mean, I think, the best way is to talk to a sports dietitian who can
Hmm.
help you kind of figure out what that means for you, given your activity, given your age, and, all these other things that we discussed. I think for a regular person, it's hard, right? Like I don't want to say that there's like a specific number or a specific formula, but I know for myself, what I try to do is notice if I'm hungry, if I'm
Hmm.
hungry all the
Yeah.
time or something like that, but also just paying attention to, if I'm doing things like even unconsciously in terms of like restricting or trying to like not eat or recover.
Hmm.
I think one of the, important things to do is really, you know, in lieu of like having a specific number, it's making sure that you're just eating consistently throughout the day,
Hmm.
um, because our bodies like being in a state of homeostasis, right? Like being in this state of balance. So
Hmm.
it doesn't like these huge swings in energy
Hmm.
availability, or deficit. So even just something simple as just making sure that you're eating consistently throughout the day, making sure that you're having like protein also distributed throughout the day, eating before you work out, even if it's just
Hmm.
a little thing, just so your body has some fuel on board, and then making sure that you are eating after your workouts, like thinking about those periods of time in which you are drawing on energy, you're forcing your body, right, to draw down on energy. So those are
Hmm.
those periods of time in which you are exercising and working out, so
Hmm.
kind of buffering some of the nutrition around those periods.
Hmm. Is there anything in terms of the type of foods that women need to be paying attention to versus men?
Yeah, so I mean, I think protein is definitely one of them, that, you know, on the whole, women, may not be getting enough protein
Hmm.
overall, and again, making sure that is
Yeah,
distributed throughout
I've
the
heard
day.
that. Yeah. So,
I also preface all this by saying I'm not a dietitian
yeah. No, but
or anything like
that
that.
rings true with some other dietitian or nutritionists that I've talked
Um, but I
about.
think
Yeah.
I think the other important piece too is making sure you're eating carbohydrates. I know that there's a lot of, still stigma around eating carbohydrates, or like
Right.
this sense that they're bad or, not good for you. But carbs are really important for female bodies, because, like we were talking about, the body is really sensitive to those downturns in nutrition. It's particularly sensitive in female bodies, and the body is particularly attuned to downturns in carbohydrate nutrition. So when you
Mhm.
aren't eating enough carbs, it almost like flips that switch a little bit faster, right? Where the body starts
Mhm.
to freak out and think that it's starving. It
Mhm.
starts to send all those messages that, oh wait, hold on, we gotta shut down some systems, and we gotta do some work here to conserve ourselves. So
Mhm.
it is making sure that you are eating carbs. Like that is a very important part of all of this.
Mhm. Interesting. What about is there any particular type of injury that women tend to be more prone to that they can be, you know, watch out for and avoid?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest ones is ACL tears.
Hmm.
And we've seen this a lot, especially in this past year amongst like high level elite women soccer players.
Hmm.
So in this lead up to the World Cup, there's been, gosh, I want to say over 20 players or something like that that are out with,
Wow.
some sort of traumatic knee injury. And I mean, that's huge, right? They're missing this
Yeah.
big, like career important tournament.
Hmm.
Um, and so we've known about this kind of disparity in ACL tear rates between men and women since the late 80s and early 90s. Um, a lot of the thinking around it has focused around, you know, women's bodies, right? Because the idea is if men aren't getting injured as much, there must be something about their bodies that makes them more durable or resistant. And then in
Hmm.
comparison, that means that there's something wrong with women's bodies. So we often compare, right, between the
Hmm.
two. And so what folks have tended to focus on are things like, yes, hormones, because again, estrogen can make the ligaments more lax and potentially more prone to injury, but also things like Q angles in the legs. So because of the wider hips, there's a higher angle between the bones in the leg, and potentially put more stress on the knees, right? That
Hmm.
that could lead to injury. What's interesting is that yes, all of those things
Hmm.
can play a role. But recently, a lot of researchers have started to step back a little bit more and look at kind of the wider context around, the environment, resources that women and girls might have, even things like strength training, which we tend to think of as like an intrinsic injury factor or risk factor,
Hmm.
because again, men tend to have more muscle mass than women, and if we have more muscle, we potentially are more resilient to injury. Um, but it's also the idea that, well, maybe girls and women haven't really been encouraged to or taught to strength train in the same way that boys have. So there's
Hmm.
been studies that have been done showing kind of differences in, definitely at the high school level, right? In terms of
Hmm.
boys teams being encouraged to go to the weight room versus girls teams
Hmm.
who are encouraged to do things like yoga and Pilates and,
Hmm.
those types of things. But those things matter, right? In
Hmm.
terms of learning how to strengthen your body, learning how to move your body, that body awareness can make a big difference. So
Hmm.
yeah, there's a ton of really interesting studies out there around this.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I tell you what, I was really blown away after about 5 years in the CrossFit community just to see, you know, what's capable for the
Yeah,
female athlete, right? I'm anyone who's been around CrossFit, and it surprised a lot of people. It's like, my God, like these women are every bit as strong and agile as their male competitor, peers. It's fascinating, and now we're seeing female athletes, striving to become special operators, right? So we have some women
yeah,
who are at Navy SEAL training, and I believe you'll see the female Navy SEAL soon, within a year or two. And it's just a matter of training your body and your mind, but training your body to be able to, handle the stress that you're putting upon it. And
for
the body
sure.
will adapt, right? So the weight training, the strength training, the combination of functional fitness, endurance, and if you train a certain way, your body will adapt. And
Yeah,
it's amazing what both male and female bodies can do. It's crazy.
absolutely.
Um, let's talk again a little bit about childbearing now, and also like post child, like, because I've seen both ways. I've seen women, especially again in CrossFit. So some women are a little crazy, like they literally will train and compete right up to like they're on their way to the hospital, and they want to run there. It
Yeah.
doesn't seem like that would be the smartest thing. But so what's the best practices for training and competing in the childbearing stages, and then also post, you know, having a
Yeah.
child?
I think, this is definitely one of those areas where there hasn't been a lot of work done um, in terms of really understanding the guidelines, right, as to what's appropriate exercise during pregnancy, or at least vigorous exercise, right, during
Hmm.
pregnancy and in the postpartum period. So we often hear things like, when you're pregnant, keep your heart rate under, I think it's like 140 beats per minute or something like
Hmm.
that. But it turns out that that wasn't actually based on science. That was kind of like
Hmm.
someone like a doctor's committee's like best guess. They're like, "Oh, that seems about like right for like moderate exercise, so let's just go with that." But that's what we keep repeating as
Right.
like the thing, right? So I think, again, this is an area in which we're learning a lot more, and we're starting to get better guidelines that are out there. And especially for those like higher level elite athletes, it's something that I know a lot of scientists are really looking at, because women want to have families, but they also want to maintain their athleticism, right? They want to continue competing. So I think, part of it is, the very unhelpful term of listening to your body, right?
Hmm.
And kind of, a lot of it does depend on kind of your level of fitness coming into pregnancy and coming,
Hmm.
and in terms of what you're able to do and maintain, right? Like what your
Hmm.
body is used to. If you haven't been very active before pregnancy, probably isn't the time to start like to pick up some,
Yeah.
like a lot of running or something
Hmm.
like that, right? Like it's probably
Hmm.
not the best time to do that. But I
Hmm.
think that if you are active coming into it, you can continue doing those things as long as it feels good to you. And, talking to your doctor if there's any pain or trouble. There are a couple of like red flags for sure,
Hmm.
in terms of like pain that you're feeling. But you can't, there's nothing to say that you can't do it, because I feel like there's often a lot of like fear around exercise and strength training while pregnant. But, those are all good things, I think, for the mom and for the baby.
Hmm.
The postpartum period is even kind of worse in terms of any sort of guidelines. I think in part because there's this assumption that the body just kind of bounces back to normal,
Right.
like almost like it just snaps back,
Yeah.
like an elastic waistband or something like that.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is that the body has undergone tremendous change, not only during pregnancy, but then also a lot of trauma during
Hmm.
childbirth. No matter what, whether you delivered, vaginally, or whether or not you had a C-section.
Hmm.
So I think that this definitely is an area to be a little bit more conservative for sure.
Hmm.
Um, but oftentimes, women will go to their doctor at 6 weeks postpartum, and the doctor will say, great, you're cleared for exercise, you can resume exercise if you want. But the reality is that at 6 weeks, it's, that 6 week clearance really is about like tissue healing. So it's like
Hmm.
it's to
Hmm.
say that your tissues are healing, there's no infection here. But it's not necessarily to say that like, okay, you can go out and run 5 miles tomorrow
Hmm.
or something like
Hmm.
that. So I think there again, there's starting to be more guidelines that are coming out, but it is taking it a little bit more slowly, and really just understanding that, it does take time to rebuild a lot of those neuromuscular connections, with your pelvic floor, with your abdominal
Hmm.
wall muscles, and like hips, legs, like everything. It takes a little bit time to rebuild those things, and to be progressive, right? Start
Hmm.
slowly and try not to rush back too quickly, because then that's almost like a recipe for, pelvic floor disorders and a
Sure.
lot of other, you know, and musculoskeletal problems.
Yeah, it almost seems like there should be a period of time where you're really just focusing on that, Pilates style core strength and mobility and flexibility, and really just rebuilding that base. So
Yeah.
before you get right back into a sport activity.
Yeah, and that's what kind of some of the current recommendations are. It's really spending those first, 2, 3 weeks or so doing like the diaphragmatic breathing,
Right.
reconnecting with your core, doing simple things even like pelvic tilts,
Hmm.
if it were if I were going through this again, I definitely would consult with a pelvic floor physiotherapist who
Hmm.
again can kind of evaluate the the state of the union, right? Like what's going
Hmm.
on down there, and if there's like any dysfunction, if there's any, muscle tears or strains or anything like that that needs attention. But they can help you then build a more progressive program and help you, like I said, reconnect that establish that neuromuscular connection, but also rebuild strength. Because no matter what kind of exercise you have done during pregnancy, you will have deconditioned, right?
Right.
So it is important to rebuild that strength to support the other activities then that you want to do.
Yeah. Is there any permanent change after postpartum, after childbirth, that would necessitate a change in training or nutrition or something around athleticism?
Uh, that's a great question. I think, a lot of it really is individual, like based
Hmm.
on an individual's experience. Like some people will go through pregnancy and childbirth and come out the other end, to, like nothing
Yeah,
happened.
nothing happened. I know. It's,
Yeah, one of these people who then are, back to running, back to doing all the things pretty quickly. And for some other people, there are very significant changes, right? Like in terms of, could be anatomical, like we said, like in terms of hips, in terms of pelvic floor,
mhm,
neuromuscular conditions and
mhm.
stuff like that. So it really does
And I've
depend.
seen metabolic changes, that just come
Yeah.
on as a result of hormonal changes and
Yeah.
stuff.
I mean, your hormones for sure are all
Yeah.
over the place and a big giant mess for a very long
Mhm,
time, especially if you are breastfeeding too.
mhm,
Um, but I think again, it's this period of time that your body is in transition. So that means that your kind of relationship with physical activity might be a little bit different, or it might
mhm,
take a little bit of getting used to this new phase, right? That's
mhm.
not to say you can't do what you've done in the past or you can't have athletic goals, but it just you're in transition, right? Your body's in a different phase. You just need to give it a little bit of time and patience to kind of reestablish its norms again.
Yeah. And what about menopause? What's the the recommendation post menopause or going through that to shift
Yeah.
things for optimizing things?
That's a big black hole.
Is it?
I
Yeah.
feel like in terms of, people are starting to pay attention to it now,
Mhm,
but in general, again, it's one of these areas where there really hasn't been a lot of attention paid to it. I
mhm.
think in part because it was almost the assumption that, that's when women kind of
Yeah,
ride
you're not
off into
doing it at
this.
that point. You're done.
You're
No,
riding off into the sunset. But,
right.
as we've seen,
No, I mean,
women want to stay active longer. They
right.
want to continue to compete longer. And so it's important that we be able to provide them with better information, better education, and they're asking for it. Like these women that I speak with who are older, are all asking, like, what am I supposed to do? Like, why don't we have better guidance and information about
Yeah.
this? And
Yeah.
just feeling like they're almost like hung out to dry, right? Like there's
Right.
no help out there.
I
Um,
think that that's true for men as well. I mean, people
yeah,
just don't study older athletes because, like you said, it was always assumed that people in their 50s and 60s are on the golf course,
yeah,
and that's really not a sport in my in my book. Not one that
exactly.
requires athletic training unless you're in the pros. But
Exactly. Well, I think
interesting,
there's also, right, the adage of like age is just a number.
right?
But yeah, it is in the sense that sure, you can still go out and do all of those things, but that doesn't recognize the fact that your body is physiologically changing, right?
Hmm.
As we age, there are these physiological changes that we do have to acknowledge and we do have to pay attention to. So for women, menopause is this bookend to puberty. So like the menstrual cycle starts to wind down and hormones start to decline, right?
Hmm.
Especially
Hmm.
estrogen and progesterone. And because estrogen, like I said, is really important for muscle health.
Hmm.
Um, in addition to the normal age related muscle deterioration that like everyone sees and
Hmm.
experiences, women experience it a little bit more because we don't have that estrogen to kind of keep bumping it up, if you
Hmm.
will.
Hmm.
So for women who are kind of approaching this like middle of life, like older stage, it is really important to strength train. And it's
Hmm.
funny, like that's I would encourage my mom to strength train. And she's like,
Hmm.
I'm too old for that, or it's like that's not what I
Never
do.
too
But
old. Right.
but it is really very much important to continue to provide your body with stimulus, right?
Hmm.
To stimulate that muscle growth and to like maintain the muscle that you do have, because there is some research that is looks at kind of body composition and how that relates to menopause symptoms, so like
Hmm.
hot flashes and night sweats and things like that, and fatigue. And the idea is that because yes, women start to gain some more fat as they go older, but because muscle mass is also decreasing so much, that that shift in almost proportion between fat and muscle is actually potentially what is connected or
Hmm.
associated with this increase in symptoms. So the idea
Hmm.
is if you can increase that muscle mass, maybe you can also offset some of these symptoms that you're experiencing. So
Hmm.
I think that's one of the important pieces. And similarly, there are some folks who recommend doing more, high intensity or vigorous exercise too,
Hmm.
for the same
Hmm.
reason, because it stimulates the muscle, but it
Hmm.
provides the body with that stimulus that estrogen was otherwise giving you. But because you
Hmm.
don't have it now, you have to kind of find it in different forms. So
Hmm.
the high intensity exercise can kind of provide that extra stimulus, that again, might make you feel a little bit better.
Yeah. What do you think about hormone replacement therapy for female athletes?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is a viable, option for, some women. Again, it kind of depends on your situation,
Hmm.
and something you obviously need to discuss with your doctor. But I think
Hmm.
for so long, I know for me, I've always had a really bad kind of perception of hormone replacement therapy. I like always thought like it's this bad thing that I never.
Cheating.
Yeah, like I don't wanna be on it. But the
Right.
reality is that for some women, it literally is life-saving,
Yeah.
right? Like their symptoms are so bad, but taking this medication really like makes a world of difference. So I
Yeah.
think it really does depend on the person and their situation. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with taking it.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. I think it can have a big difference. Is any particular equipment that are designed specifically for female athletes that would be interesting to know about?
Um, I think, the most obvious one that comes to mind is the sports bra.
Oh yeah.
Um
Well, that makes sense. Yeah.
Obviously. But that's a really interesting story in the sense
Right.
that, the first sports bra wasn't designed until 1977.
Amazing.
Um, and right, it's less than 50 years ago. And so not so long ago when these women sewed together two jock straps and,
That's awesome.
created this, created this thing. Because up until that time, there was no good way to support breasts
Right.
while you were running, while you were being active. And so
Hmm.
women had to resort to like wearing two bras on top of each other, or wearing a bra that was smaller in size, or,
Hmm.
a variety of different things.
Hmm.
But what's interesting about that is that women often complain that sports bras are terrible. They don't fit well. They don't support
Hmm.
you well. They're uncomfortable. They're painful. And I think that's in large part because we haven't actually studied breast biomechanics until the last 20 years or so, or at least, breast biome people have been studying it, but I think having the right technology to really understand the complex movement of breasts wasn't available until about 20 years ago. And so if you can't study or really understand how breasts move while you are being active, it's really hard, right? Then to design a garment that's supposed to support that movement and be comfortable. So I think we're starting to see a lot of brands and companies out there incorporate more scientific data and like this type of testing and biomechanical testing into their product design process. And so we're starting to see some better sports bras getting out onto the market, but hopefully we'll start to see more.
Yeah, that's cool. Now, you mentioned that you do yoga. I've been a yogi for many years, and I actually take credit for helping the SEALs start to do yoga.
That's
Because
great.
I started teaching Navy SEAL candidates yoga back in 2006, but I had to trick them, right? So I didn't, at first I was calling it yoga and I was using all the Sanskrit stuff because
Yeah.
I've got over like 1,000 hours of teacher training myself and different things. And their eyes would just kind of roll back in their head and literally would completely ignore me. So I said, okay, that's not going to work. So I just started like breaking the asanas down into drills and linking
Mm.
certain drills and say, okay, this is the hip mobility drill. And really it was just like, a few sun sails with a few,
Yeah.
twists in, and had a shoulder mobility drill and, a comprehensive spinal, healing thing. And it was all just like, it was about 25 asanas that I just, simple ones that I put together. And then same thing with breathing. I didn't use any Sanskrit terms like pranayama. I just called it box breathing, and told them the physiological benefits. And man, within like weeks of innovating that, and I put air quotes up because didn't take that much innovation. Um, they were just having extraordinary
Mm.
results. They were loving it, right? And so we did it after every single workout. We would do like a 15-minute asana session. Before every workout, we were doing a breathing and visualization.
Mm.
And during the workout, um, or as part of the training session, we would design a pre-training mobility session that worked the joints and muscle systems in the movement patterns that they were going to experience that day.
Mm.
And we saw injury rates just plummet, and we saw performance skyrocket, and it was just huge. And so it seemed like such a no-brainer to me that this ancient wisdom can be used for both physiological, and psychological optimization.
Yeah.
Is that your perspective, or how do you look at yoga for both your own training and for women?
Absolutely. I mean, I 100% agree with you in the sense that, right, it's this way to move the body and mobilize things in a dynamic way,
Right.
um, that can be really beneficial. And I think for me, at least, it really helped improve, like, my body awareness and
Mm-hmm.
just the sense of really understanding where my body was in space, how to move it, how to engage different
Yep.
muscles.
Proprioception is so
Yeah,
powerful for that. Yeah.
in a way that I don't think I would have gotten out of any other sort of training.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think when I first started doing yoga, it was very much like I was running. I'm like, oh, I should probably stretch
Right.
or something
Most
like
people
that.
approach it as a little
Yeah.
stretchy, or even a workout itself.
Yeah, and it became the thing where I was like, "Oh,
Mm-hmm.
I just wanna work out," right? Like, I just wanna do fast, like, sweaty vinyasa flows and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that. But it really, like, I think over the years and as I began to teach as well, it became this, practice of, again, just feeling very grounded in my body and really kind of understanding, um, a way to check in with
Mm-hmm.
what was going on and how I was
Mm-hmm.
feeling in a way that was unique. I couldn't
Mm-hmm.
quite get that out of any other, you
Right.
know, physical modality or, anything else. And it was, yeah, it was lovely. I will say, like, once I did start training, going to yoga class became very different. Like, I couldn't shut off my
Mm-hmm.
brain because I kept trying to figure out, like, what is the teacher doing? Like, what is the sequence that's
Mm-hmm.
going on? Oh, I like how they're linking this to that. So it kind of took a little bit of my joy out of it.
That's funny. Yeah, I got to a point where I just don't go to a studio anymore.
Yeah.
I just design my own programs, and I do it with my wife, and we do it
Yeah.
every day for half an hour. It's extraordinary. I hope everyone listening has or can take up a yoga practice to complement their athletic training, or just for life
Yeah.
optimization and longevity. It's extraordinary.
Absolutely.
So your book, Up to Speed: Groundbreaking Science of Women Athletes. It's Is that your first book?
It is my first book.
Congratulations. Good
Thank
job.
you.
And so what did you learn? We got to wrap up here, but this is kind of like final kind of
Yeah.
thought line here. What did you learn from writing that book that got you excited about what's next? Like the next
Mm.
vein that you want to plumb.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't quite figured out what that next thing is yet, but I think for me is really, I mean, seeing all this opportunity and possibility, right?
Hmm.
In the sense that, like, with regard to women specific research and all of this, it's sports performance and training, we really are just getting started. We
Yeah.
really are just starting to ask a lot of these questions. Like, absolutely recognizing all the pioneers that have come before and all the work that folks have done, but it does really feel like we're kind of at this moment where, um, we're starting to feel a little bit more momentum,
Hmm.
both in terms of the research side, but also in terms of like interest in women's sports. It feels like finally, finally,
Hmm.
people are starting to pay attention. So I'm
Hmm.
really excited and curious to see kind of where this goes. Right, like
Hmm.
if we study this more, if we learn more, if we provide better knowledge and education, to younger girls, right, as they start off,
Hmm.
what does that do, right? Like, how does that set folks up for, a healthy and kind of long term life as an athlete, as a physically
Right.
active person? So I'm really excited about that option and possibility. But I'm also, personally really interested in how all of this connects to the mental side of sport,
Hmm.
like mental
Right.
health, as well as like mental, I guess mental fitness, if you
Hmm.
want to call it that.
Hmm.
But that aspect is something that I wanted to touch upon a little bit more in this book.
Hmm.
But I feel like that might be kind of the next
That could be
part, but
next.
we'll see.
That's been my passion. In fact, one of my books is called Unbeatable Mind.
Yeah, yeah,
So, but I would love to see the Unbeatable Mind for women. If you want to
yeah.
collaborate on that, let's chat. That would be great.
Absolutely.
All right, Christine. What a great conversation. Thanks so much for your time and for doing the work you do. And I think there's a lot of women out there who are really, um, you know, stoked to have some attention placed on the nuances, right? So it's important work. Are you actually? I'm just curious. Are you in touch with, or do you get connected to researchers who are like, hey, I read your book and really want to pick up a study or this line of thought and do some research? Because you're more of a journalist, right? You're not like a hardcore academic
No, I'm not
researcher.
an academic.
Yeah,
I'm 100% a journalist.
yeah,
So I'm the one who reads the studies, talks,
yeah.
asks a lot of questions, and then
But
tries to,
your work can expose gaps, right?
yeah,
And kind of like a lit review, and so someone could be like, "Oh, I see from Christine's work that there's this couple strands that they could follow that are most
yeah,
important, most valuable."
yeah. Hopefully. I mean, that's what I kind of hope is that this book brings together a lot of different strands because I did feel like a lot of this information was one kind of back behind
Right?
academic paywalls.
Yeah.
But then
That's
also,
the case with a lot of this stuff. Like
yeah,
I'm getting my doctorate right now, and a lot of the stuff I see is like, wham, this should be out in the public. You know what I mean?
yeah,
And you have
yeah.
popular authors, and I put myself in that category where I like putting out stuff that really doesn't. You don't think it has any validation or research behind it, but it does. It's just not out there.
But yeah, no one
You
has
can't even
access to
find
it.
it. The article is like
Yeah.
you have to go to ProQuest and pay $45 for it.
Exactly.
It's
Or
like
or
what?
no one wants to read it, right? Because it's,
Right?
like,
Exactly.
really dry academic writing.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I mean, that was part of it, and part of it was just seeing a lot of this information really siloed too, right? So we would talk about things like, menstrual cycle health, and we talk about, like, ACL tears and concussions, but they would
Right.
all just be in different silos, but not
Yeah.
all connected. So that's my hope for the book is that it helps to bring some of these issues
I
together.
love that. Yeah, I think that's great. I'm with you on that because that's the problem with our entire academic and scientific community is it's just separated everything to a million little parts, and then it separates those.
Yeah.
But there's nobody bringing it all back together,
Yeah.
and that's one of my jobs or one of my goals in leadership development is to bring it all back together because we're whole people. We develop the whole. And if you just try to develop the parts, you end up with a bunch of shiny parts that don't really work well together necessarily.
100%. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much again for your time. It's been a great conversation. I
No,
really appreciate it, Christine.
thank you so much for having me. It's
Yeah,
been a great conversation.
likewise.